All right, so Renaissance and Reformation. Introduction. Okay, so in this chapter, you'll learn about the important changes that led to the end of the medieval period or the Middle Ages and the dawn of what we live in today, which is the modern age. So the Renaissance and Reformation were major developments that helped shape the world as we have today. And this is one of Da Vinci's inventions, one of his drawings of an invention. Vocabulary that we will go over during the week. The essential questions that you'll have at the end of the chapter, your short answers. So what events contributed to the end of the Middle Ages, which we'll go over in part 1. What was the Renaissance and why did it happen? And then would a Protestant Reformation have occurred without Martin Luther? So part 1, end of the Middle Ages. So the waning of the Middle Ages, which means the last part of the Middle Ages when it starts to kind of finally die off when we get into the modern ages. So at the start of the 12th century, life in Europe began to change. The Crusades had brought back all these new goods and ideas from the East. And this started to stimulate the rebirth of trade. And when you trade, you exchange new ideas. The exchanging of new ideas is going to take you from one era to the next. They also weakened the Byzantine Empire. And this also contributed later to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. So new trade led to the growth of towns, the development of a middle class, which was a big thing. That's really what you want. You want to have a large middle class, and the greater use of money. So once you start to develop more use of money, instead of performing services for their feudal lords, so instead of growing the crop and then giving part of the crop to the feudal lord, a lot of them started to use money to pay their lords instead. So other events that contributed to the end of the Middle Ages or medieval times, the Great Famine, which we're going to cover, Black Death, which we're going to cover, the 100 Years' War, and the Great Schism. So here are the different crusades. These are the major ones, the 4 major crusades. They go into the Holy Land, and they're going to bring back all of these new ideas back into Europe. So the first one is the Great Famine. And what you had was unusually heavy rains that led to flooding, and eventually the crop spoiled. So you get too much rain, and actually, if you're growing wheat or whatever, it starts to, get mold on it and things like that. So the crops spoil, and the livestock started to drown in these waterlogged fields. So they're kind of stuck in the mud, and they actually drown. So the result of the Great Famine, farm animals that were needed for work, ones that, they used year in and year out, ended up having to be killed so that they could be eaten. And also the grain was eaten. The grain that they were going to use the seed from to replant their new crops, he had to eat that also. So this shortage of grain increased grain prices by more than 6 times. So people couldn't even pay to buy the food either. So millions of people died from the famine. And what happened is you start to question the church. So the church was the most important thing during the Middle Ages, but now you start to question the church. Why are you allowing this to happen to me? Why is God not coming in and helping us? And here's some pictures from the time, and this is straight from this book right here, The Third Horseman. So famine, the 4 horsemen are the ones of the apocalypse that come in to pretty much end the world. And it's just kind of showing how bad it was in Europe at that time. So the Black Death, which everyone should have heard of before. So the Black Death, which is actually the bubonic plague. It occurred only 25 years after the Great Famine. So if you lived through the Great Famine, then you might have even had to go through the Black Death also. So what happened is rats and fleas, of course, carrying the disease entered Europe from the Asian trading ships, which I'll show you a map, between 1347 and 1351. 25 million people, almost 1/3 of Europe's population died in this epidemic. So 1 out of every 3 people in Europe passed away because of the Black Death. So people were buried in mass graves without receiving any blessings from the church, which you needed to be blessed at that time. People felt that you needed to be blessed. That way you could get into heaven. So what they do is they go around, they start to blame people. So some blame the Jewish people. They said that they were poisoning the wells. Of course, they weren't. Others blame the plague on God, saying that God is punishing them for their sinful living that they had gone through. So they really didn't know. They had no scientific idea what was going on. So they just went out and started to blame other groups. So the Black Death occurred. I'm sorry, the Black Death created a labor shortage in Europe. So if you were a peasant at the time, you were needed now. So really more than ever. So the Black Death actually kind of lifts you out of this slavery servitude that you had been in during the Middle Ages. So large numbers of peasants escaped from serfdom. Serfdom is when you're tied to the land. When landowners and towns needing labor offered them freedom in exchange for work. So this is a doctor at the time, and I've got a better picture of that later on. Some of the mass graves, and if you go down into the caves and stuff in Europe below the cities, you'll see these areas that are just riddled with bones. And what you have is these ships that were coming out of Asia. Really, they're coming in for trade. They're not doing it on purpose. They would stop in these port towns, and these port towns, of course, the rats would get off the ship, and then they would go into the town and spread the bubonic plague. So this is why it's called the Black Death. Okay, it would turn certain parts of your body black. Here's a flea, and then here's some of the and they find these when they're actually trying to make new buildings and stuff in Europe. They'll find these mass graves of people who were just buried during the Black Death. All right, and of course, flea, very similar to the mosquito, almost comes in, and it'll pretty much get rid of whatever it's in its stomach into your system, and that's how the Black Death is spread. So people were burned. Okay, this is a painting showing people probably with the plague that were burned. That way, they couldn't pass it on to other people. And then this is a painting from pretty much from the time, just showing how bad it was in Europe, how many people are dying and different things. And it shows the church. It shows pretty much shows hell on earth. And this was another way that the church tried to solve the problem. Again, they didn't know what was going on. So what you had was people who would go through towns and they would whip themselves. And a lot of these whips had small hooks on them, so their backs would be just completely bloody. And they thought that was a way to, to drive out the bubonic plague, or to, purify the town that they were going through. And of course, you're just spreading the disease even more when you're doing that. And here's a good picture of what the doctors would wear. And those would have like herbs and scents inside and stuff like that. They thought that would help them. And feudalism didn't survive the Black Death. Okay, so feudalism causes peasants to become more important and kind of messes up the whole system, which was a good thing for those people that were tied to the land. So another thing that wiped out the Middle Ages was the 100 Years' War. So in the 100 Years' War between England and France, when that broke out, actually what happened is the King of France died. And since he did not have an heir to the throne, the King of England just said, okay, I'm now the new French king also. So they're going to go to war against each other. So what happened is they fight for so long that the kings of both countries end up just developing their own army. So like I said, so this long period of warfare slowly strengthened royal power in both countries. So the kings became more powerful than the lords. And instead of relying on feudal armies, which were the knights, based on service of his nobles. So remember, the nobles would send the king knights. Each king just had their own army. So they didn't need to call on these knights anymore. And then new weapons also emerged. So you had the English longbow, and then later on, of course, gunpowder, cannons come in from China. So the knights become less important. So this kind of weakens the power of the nobles. The kings didn't need them as much anymore. And then this really weakens the knights. The knights are just kind of, they're out of date, to tell you the truth. So both England and France also developed greater national feeling and loyalty to their king. So the feeling of loyalty to the lords went away, and now you're more loyal to the king. And Joan of Arc, a young French maiden, rallied the French troops during this time. And she was the one who, said, okay, no, we need a Frenchman to be king of France. So she turned the tide when she successfully drove the English out of the city of Orleans and crowned the new French king at the cathedral. Later, Joan was captured and she was burned at the stake by the English as a witch. since she had defeated the English army. But within 20 years after her death, the war was over, and France got to keep their kingdom, and they got to keep their king. Another cause of the end of the Middle Ages is the Great Schism, which is kind of what it sounds like. Schism is a split. So the Pope often clashed with Europe's secular leaders. So the Pope, who's the head of the Roman Catholic Church, a lot of times would have problems with the different kings of England and France and things like that. So kings sought the right to appoint their own bishops. So instead of the Pope appointing a bishop that would be in charge of their country to help out the king, the kings wanted to do this. They wanted to be able to appoint who they wanted. The kings also knew that the church controlled a lot of the land. Remember when we talked about the Middle Ages, people when they died, they would give the church all the land, hoping they would get into heaven. So the church ended up with a lot of land. They also wanted to be able to try priests in their own court. So if a priest did something wrong, then the king wanted to try that priest. But the way it is, kind of even today, is if a priest does something wrong in that country, he's taken back and he's brought in front of the Pope. And the kings also wanted to tax the church lands. So they wanted to get some money from the church, is what they wanted. And the Pope, of course, resisted all those things. So the Pope didn't want to give up the land, didn't want to give up the right to appoint bishops, didn't want to give up the right to have his priests put on trial in other countries. And of course, they're definitely not going to want to pay the taxes. So in 1305, a Frenchman was elected Pope, and he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon in France, where it fell under the French king's influence. So in 1378, an Italian was elected Pope, who decided to move the papacy back to Rome. So now it's been moved from Rome to France, and now they're going to move it from France back to Rome. French cardinals, of course, living in France, claimed that the election was unlawful, and they elected another French pope to keep the papacy in France. So now you end up with two popes. And this is kind of the split. So the Roman Pope is going to live here in the Holy Roman Empire, and then, of course, another Pope is going to be in France. So this is the Great Schism. And the schism, which means split, greatly weakened the church's authority. A church council made matters even worse by electing a third pope in 1409. Finally, a new church council deposed all three popes and elected a single pope in 1417. But by this time, people are just thinking, what is the church doing? So, they questioned during the famine, what is the church doing? And now they just kind of think that maybe the church doesn't know what's going on. They elect three popes. So graphic organizers. Okay, so the different things that caused the end of the Middle Ages. You had the Crusades, you had the Black Death, you had the Great Schism, and the 100 Years' War. And they have different reasons why they ended the